There was a time when rarity wasn't a marketing goal. It was simply a consequence. In the 1950s, some American cars were born to dominate sales, fill showrooms, and conquer the highways of the United States. But others took a very different path. They were more expensive than the public expected, more daring than the market was ready to accept, or simply too special to become mass-market successes. And precisely because of that, today they occupy a very different place in history. But here's the interesting question. Which American cars of the 1950s were truly rare, not by accident, but by the way they were conceived? In this video, we're going to explore some of the rarest American automobiles of the 1950s. Not just low production models, but the ones that, because of price, design, or market decisions, ended up becoming true collector pieces. And trust me, some of the cars you're about to see were far more exclusive than most people imagine. Let's begin. 1953 Packard Caribbean. If there was a car in the 1950s born to be exclusive from day one, it was this. The Caribbean was never meant to conquer the mass market. Packard had something far more ambitious in mind, to prove it could still compete at the very top of American luxury. And to do it, the company made a move that today seems almost unthinkable, building a near handcrafted convertible in an era dominated by volume production. Visually, the impact was immediate. The long, low body delivered pure classic American elegance, but with a level of refinement that clearly set it apart from many contemporary rivals. The lines were clean, the chrome use carefully measured, and the two-tone combinations helped the car stand out without falling into excess. It didn't need to shout to feel special. You could tell at first glance. Inside, the experience reinforced that sense of exclusivity. High-quality materials, wide seating, and an atmosphere designed more to impress a demanding buyer than to seduce the general public. But what truly sealed its fate as a rarity was production. In 1953, Packard built only about 750 Caribbean units, an extremely low figure even for a luxury convertible of the era. It wasn't an outright failure, but it was limited enough to become highly sought after by collectors today. Under the hood, it didn't disappoint either. It featured Packard's refined inline 8-cylinder engine, producing around 180 horsepower. That number may not sound explosive today, but in its context, it delivered smooth, confident power, perfectly aligned with the car's elegant character. And that's the key to its legacy. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most produced, but it was exactly the kind of automobile that turns time into exclusivity. Today, a well-preserved 1953 Packard Caribbean typically ranges between $90,000 and $150,000, with exceptional examples easily exceeding that. And the most interesting part is this. We're only beginning to see how rare some American cars of the 1950s could truly be. 1956 Continental Mark II. If the Packard we just saw represented exclusive luxury, this car took that idea to a completely different level, because the Continental Mark II was never meant for mass sales. It was built to show just how far American luxury could go when prestige mattered more than volume. In the mid-1950s, Ford made a bold decision: create a near hand-built coupe to compete at the very top of the market. The goal wasn't to dominate showrooms, it was to build one of the most refined cars in the United States, and visually, that's immediately clear. While many rivals leaned into tail fins and heavy chrome, this model chose restraint. The body is clean, low, and perfectly proportioned. The front end is controlled, and the spare tire integrated into the trunk adds character without breaking the elegance. It didn't try to impress at first glance, but the longer you looked, the clearer it became that it was playing in a different league. Inside, the seriousness continued. Ultra-high quality materials, near hand-built assembly, and an overall sense of precision that was rare in Detroit in 1956. This wasn't just a luxury coupe, it was a prestige statement. And here's where the rarity becomes real. The Mark II was so expensive to produce that Ford lost money on every unit sold. The price exceeded even many Cadillacs of the era, and the market responded exactly as you'd expect. Between 1956 and 1957, just over 3,000 units were built. Under the hood sat a 368 cubic inch V8, producing about 285 horsepower, delivered with the smoothness that defined the entire project. And that's why it holds its status today. It wasn't common, it wasn't mass market, it was uncompromising American luxury. Today, a well-preserved Continental Mark II typically ranges between $70,000 and $120,000. And what comes next proves that rarity in the 1950s could appear where you least expected it. 1958 Buick Limited. And this is where the rarity story takes an unexpected turn, because unlike the previous cars, designed to be exclusive from the start, this Buick was never meant to be rare. The market simply stopped looking in its direction. By the late 1950s, Buick doubled down on full-size luxury, and the Limited represented the absolute peak of that philosophy. It was big, imposing, and visually impossible to ignore. The problem was timing. Public taste was beginning to shift, and this giant arrived just as the era of excess was starting to fade. Visually, the impact remains massive even today. The body is long and dramatic, with chrome used far more expressively than in the earlier models we saw. The wide front end, presence-heavy sidelines, and low stance create a car that never goes unnoticed. It wasn't discreet. It didn't want to be. But here's the interesting part. Despite its size and ambition, sales were surprisingly low. In 1958, just over 7,000 limited units were produced, a very small number for a full-size Buick in the golden age of the American automobile. It wasn't conceived as a limited production model, but the market turned it into one. Inside, the focus was clear. American luxury at its most generous, wide seating, quality materials, and a sense of space that made even large sedans of the era feel restrained. Under the hood, the Limited carried the powerful 364 cubic inch nailhead V8 producing around 300 horsepower. It wasn't a sports car, but it had more than enough power to move this massive body with authority and smoothness. And that's what makes it so interesting today. It wasn't rare by design, it was rare by timing. Today, a well-preserved 1958 Buick Limited typically ranges between $60,000 and $100,000, with exceptional examples exceeding that. And now, I want your opinion. Of the three we've seen so far, the exclusivity of the Packard, the near hand-built luxury of the Continental, or the imposing presence of the Buick, which one would earn a spot in your garage? Tell me in the comments, because what comes next completely changes the type of rarity. 1957, Chrysler 300C. Up to this point, rarity had mostly been tied to luxury, but this car introduces a different ingredient: performance with pedigree. By the mid-1950s, Chrysler had already made it clear that the 300 series was not just an elegant coupe. It was the brand statement that American luxury could also move very fast when it wanted to. And the 1957 300C was one of the highest expressions of that philosophy. Visually, the car projects authority from every angle. The body is long, wide, and firmly planted. The front end carries real visual weight, and the rear fins, more pronounced than on earlier models, give it a much more decisive presence without falling into the chaotic excess of the late decade. It doesn't look nervous, it looks confident. Inside, the focus remained clearly premium. Quality materials, wide seating, and an atmosphere that blended serious comfort with a clear driver-oriented feel. This wasn't just a car to be seen in, it was built to devour highways. And when we look at the numbers, the rarity starts to take shape. In 1957, Chrysler produced approximately 1,918 units of the 300C, a very low figure for a high-profile coupe during the peak expansion of the American market, and enough to make it one of the most sought-after letter cars among collectors today. Under the hood lived one of its strongest arguments, the massive 392 cubic inch Hemi 5.8 delivered up to 375 horsepower in its most powerful versions. For 1957, that firmly placed the 300C in serious territory, blending grand touring luxury with performance many rivals simply could not match. That's the key to its modern appeal. It wasn't common, it wasn't cheap, and it definitely wasn't slow. Today, a well-preserved 1957 Chrysler 300C typically ranges between $90,000 and $160,000, with exceptional examples climbing well beyond that. And as we move forward, 1950s, rarity begins to take even more unexpected forms. 1954, Kaiser Darrin. And now, rarity stops being subtle. Because while the previous cars became scarce due to price, positioning, or technical ambition, the Kaiser Darrin took a far riskier path, being different from the very first glance. And it was. In the early 1950s, Kaiser didn't have the industrial weight of Detroit's major manufacturers. So, it made an unexpected move, betting on a lightweight, elegant, visually daring sports car in a market still dominated by large, heavy bodies. The result was this. Visually, the Darrin looks like almost nothing else from its era. The body is low, compact, and clearly influenced by European design. The smooth front end, flowing lines, and light proportions give it a completely different personality within the American landscape of 1954. But the detail that turned it into a legend is in the doors. Instead of swinging outward, the Kaiser Darrin's doors slide forward into the front fenders. A system as unusual as it was complex, and still one of the model's most memorable features today. It was innovative, but also risky, and the market made that clear. In 1954, only about 435 Kaiser Darrin units were produced, an extremely low number even for a niche sports car, making it today one of the rarest American cars of the entire decade. Under the hood sat a 161 cubic inch inline six, producing around 90 horsepower. And that's exactly why it's so fascinating today. It wasn't the most powerful, it wasn't the most luxurious, but it was one of the boldest. Today, a well-preserved Kaiser Darrin typically ranges between $100,000 and $180,000, with exceptional examples exceeding that. 1953, Studebaker Starliner. After the technical extravagance of the Kaiser, rarity returns in a much quieter form, because the Starliner wasn't a strange car. It wasn't outrageous, and precisely for that reason, many people overlooked it for years. But today, for those who truly understand 1950s American design, this Studebaker holds a very special place. When it debuted early in the decade, its silhouette was surprisingly advanced. Low, long, and clean, with a pillarless hardtop roof that gave it a visual fluidity many larger manufacturers would take years to match. While others were still overloading their bodies with trim, this car showed an uncommon clarity of line. It was elegant, but effortless. And the most interesting part is that this beauty did not translate into market dominance. In 1953, Studebaker produced approximately 10,418 Starliner hardtops. Not a microscopic number in absolute terms, but low enough and heavily overshadowed by Detroit competition to make it today one of the most underrated and relatively rare coupes of its generation. Inside, the approach matched the exterior. The cabin felt clean, well-proportioned, and more modern than many direct rivals. It didn't try to impress through excessive luxury, but through balance and taste. That's the reason for its growing recognition among collectors. It wasn't an outright failure. It wasn't a blockbuster success, but it was far more sophisticated than the market fully appreciated at the time. Today, a well-preserved Studebaker Starliner typically ranges between $35,000 and $70,000, depending on condition and originality. Now, I want your opinion. Among the rare cars we've seen so far, the exclusivity of the Packard, the bold engineering of the Kaiser, or the quiet elegance of the Studebaker, which one interests you the most to own today? Tell me in the comments, because what comes next moves into a much more serious level of exclusivity. 1957, Dual-Ghia convertible. And this is where rarity stops being a curiosity and becomes something almost handcrafted. While many manufacturers in the 1950s competed for volume, showroom presence, and market share, the Dual-Ghia played in a completely different world. This was not a car built for the masses. It was an automobile created almost exclusively for a very specific elite. And you can see it immediately. Visually, it blends American proportions with clear Italian design influence. The body is low, elegant, and beautifully balanced, with clean lines that communicate sophistication without relying on excessive chrome. It doesn't look like a typical Detroit product, and that was exactly the point. In fact, part of its exclusivity came from how it was built. The body was manufactured in Italy and then completed in the United States, an expensive and complex process that severely limited production. The result was a car that felt different from day one, almost tailor-made for a very small circle of buyers, and the numbers confirm it. Between 1956 and 1958, approximately 117 Dual-Ghia convertibles were produced, an extremely low figure even by the most exclusive standards of the era, which explains why seeing one outside major collections today is so rare. Under the hood, it carried Chrysler's 315 cubic inch V8, producing around 260 horsepower. It wasn't the most brutal engine of the decade, but it delivered smooth, confident thrust, perfectly aligned with the car's grand touring character. And that is the essence of this model. It wasn't trying to be popular. It wasn't trying to be accessible. It was built to be exclusive from day one. Today, a well-preserved Dual-Ghia convertible can easily exceed $200,000, with exceptional examples reaching far higher at major auctions. And as we approach the end of this list, 1950s rarity is about to become even more unexpected. 1956, Packard Predictor. And now, rarity enters experimental territory, because up to this point, we've seen cars that became exclusive due to price, limited production, or market decisions. But the Predictor was something different from the very beginning. It was never meant to be sold. It was created to showcase the future. By the mid-1950s, Packard was already under intense competitive pressure. The brand needed to prove it still had vision, still had engineering strength, and could still surprise the market. The Predictor was born precisely for that purpose. Visually, it was a clear leap beyond anything the brand had produced before. The body was low, clean, and far ahead of its time. The sharper front end, flowing side profile, and unique roof treatment made the car look closer to the next decade than to 1956. It didn't look like a traditional Packard, and that was completely intentional. The interior followed the same futuristic philosophy: advanced instrumentation for the era, unconventional solutions, and a clear intention to show where the brand wanted to go. It was less a production car and more a technological statement. And this is where rarity becomes absolute. The Packard Predictor was a one-off concept. Only a single unit was built. That places it in a completely different category within this list. It isn't rare because it sold poorly. It's rare because it was never intended for production in the first place. Under the hood, it used Packard's contemporary mechanical base, more than sufficient to move the prototype. But in this case, performance was secondary. The real objective was design, innovation, and impact. And that's its historical importance. It wasn't a commercial success. It wasn't a production car. It was a vision of what Packard believed the future would be. 1950, Crosley Hot Shot. And this is where rarity changes scale completely, because after large luxury coupes, futuristic experiments, and near hand-built convertibles, the Hot Shot appears as something entirely different in the American landscape of the 1950s, smaller, lighter, and far more unusual than many people remember. At the start of the decade, Crosley wasn't trying to compete with Detroit on size or prestige. Its bet was different. Build an affordable, agile sports car, unlike anything dominating American roads at the time. The result was this small roadster. Visually, the Hot Shot breaks from almost everything we've seen on this list. The body is compact, open, and very simple, with proportions that feel closer to lightweight European sports cars than to the large post-war American machines. It doesn't try to impose presence through size, it does it through personality. And true to that philosophy, production was limited. Between 1949 and 1952, approximately 2,498 Crosley Hot Shots were produced across all variants. A low number, even for a niche sports car, and enough to make it today a curious and increasingly appreciated piece among collectors of small American sports cars. Under the hood sat a tiny four-cylinder engine producing just 44 horsepower. It may sound modest, and it was, but the secret was weight. The car was extremely light, which allowed it to deliver a surprisingly agile driving experience for its size. Today, a well-preserved Crosley Hot Shot typically ranges between $20,000 and $40,000, depending on condition and originality. 1959, Cadillac Eldorado Brougham. And to close this journey, rarity returns to the very top of American luxury. Because if there was a car in the 1950s that combined exclusivity, sky-high price, and uncompromising technical ambition, it was this. The Eldorado Brougham wasn't simply an expensive Cadillac. It was the brand's way of showing just how far it could go when prestige mattered more than profit. And from the very first glance, the message was clear. The body was low, long, and deeply elegant, with a level of detail that immediately set it apart from the rest of the Cadillac lineup. It didn't look like a conventional sedan. It looked like something built for a higher class entirely. Inside, the level of sophistication was even more evident. The cabin was packed with advanced features for the era: air suspension, extensive power equipment, and materials intended to compete directly with the best luxury cars in the world. Cadillac wasn't trying to follow trends. It was trying to define them, but all that ambition came at a cost. Between 1959 and 1960, approximately 1,400 units of the second-generation Eldorado Brougham were produced, a very low figure for Cadillac, and a direct reflection of how expensive it was to build and sell a car at this level. Under the hood sat the refined 390 cubic inch V8, producing around 345 horsepower. It wasn't built for aggressive driving, but for smooth, commanding motion, and that's why it holds such a special place today. It wasn't a mass seller. It wasn't a typical Cadillac. It was American luxury pushed to the extreme. Today, a well-preserved 1959 Eldorado Brougham typically ranges between $120,000 and $200,000, with exceptional examples far exceeding that. And after seeing all these models, one thing becomes very clear. In the 1950s, rarity wasn't always planned, but it ended up creating some of the most fascinating cars in American history. Now, I want your opinion. Of all the rare machines we saw today, which one surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy these deep dives into hidden American automotive gems, I recommend the video now, appearing on your screen, where we explore the most beautiful American cars of the 1960s. Click, and let's keep discovering America's automotive golden age. See you there.